During a heartfelt segment of his show, Steve Harvey receives an unexpected emotional message from Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traore. The message, filled with respect, admiration, and raw emotion, catches Harvey off guard, bringing him to tears on live TV. This rare and powerful moment touches the hearts of millions as two influential figures share a deep, unscripted emotional exchange. Steve Harvey walked onto his talk show stage wearing his usual bright smile. The audience clapped and cheered, and Steve, full of energy, launched into the day's topic, the power of purpose. It was supposed to be an ordinary segment. He had just finished sharing a personal story about his struggles growing up in poverty when a production assistant walked briskly toward the stage, whispering something in Steve's ear. Steve looked confused, then surprised, then silent. He turned to the camera, cleared his throat, and said, Folks, I've just been told there's a very special message for me, and it's coming from somewhere I never expected. Burkina Faso." The screen behind him lit up with a golden seal and the bold words, "Message from President Ibrahim Traore." The studio went completely quiet. Not a whisper, not a cough. Steve, now visibly shaken, looked into the camera and said softly, "Why would the president of Burkina Faso want to send me a message? I don't even know what this is about." He sat down, eyes locked on the screen, and then the video began. The video opened with a calm, warm background. A simple wooden desk, a flag of Burkina Faso behind it. Then appeared a man with strong eyes and a gentle voice, President Ibrahim Traore. Steve leaned forward, his fingers tightening around the arms of his chair. "Mr. Steve Harvey," the president began in English with a soft African accent, "I speak to you not just as a leader, but as a brother." The entire studio leaned in. "You don't know me, but we know you," Traore continued. "In the villages of Burkina Faso, your voice reaches farther than you may think. Your words of strength, faith, and second chances have touched people you'll never meet." Steve blinked, stunned. His hands began to tremble slightly. Traore's voice thickened with emotion. "During our darkest nights, when war threatened our peace, your story gave me hope. You reminded me that leadership is not about titles, but about purpose and heart." The room fell into absolute silence. Then Traore looked directly into the camera and said, "From a soldier who rose to lead his people, to a boy who once had nothing in America, I thank you." Steve's lips parted, but no words came out. Only the beginning of tears. For the first time in a long time, Steve Harvey was speechless. He reached for a tissue as the message continued. "I've watched you cry for others, laugh with strangers, give to those who thought they were forgotten," Traore's voice echoed. "In my country, we know that kind of heart. We call it a heart of the sun, warm, brave, and giving light." Steve finally whispered, "Wow." The president paused, then continued, "This message is not political. It is personal. I see in you the story of a man who never gave up, and it reminds me to never give up on my people." The message ended with Traore saying something in Maure, the native language of Burkina Faso. Steve turned to his team, his voice cracking. What did he say at the end? A translator nearby stood and replied gently. He said, "Even the strongest man needs to be reminded that his voice still matters." Steve covered his face. The crowd was crying. Even the cameraman's hands were shaking. This wasn't just a TV moment. It was a moment of souls meeting, across oceans, across struggle, across brotherhood. And it had only just begun. Steve sat quietly, his hands folded, his eyes glistening. The audience waited, but he couldn't speak. Something heavy had touched his spirit, a weight of truth, of connection, of being seen. After a pause, Steve looked up and said, "You know, you never think that your words go that far. You just try to be real, try to survive, try to help." The crowd clapped gently, but Steve raised his hand to stop them. "This ain't about applause," he said. "This is about purpose." Backstage, the producers debated cutting to a commercial. Steve refused. "I want the world to hear every second of this. Don't stop the feed." Then, as the cameras zoomed in on Steve, a second surprise came. A live connection. The screen flickered. Suddenly, President Ibrahim Traore appeared on video, not pre-recorded this time. Steve gasped. "Mr. Harvey," Traore said, smiling gently, "for once let me speak to you, man to man, not from one country to another, from one dreamer to another." The studio fell silent again. A storm of emotion was rising, and no one was ready for what the president would say next. Traore leaned in toward the camera, his tone soft and sincere. "You see me now as a president," he said, "but I was once a boy with no shoes. I walked barefoot to school. I carried books tied with string, and many nights I went to sleep hungry." Steve lowered his head. His shoulders moved as he held back tears. The president continued, "When I was a teenager, I saw war with my own eyes. I saw people give up, but I also saw people rise." He paused, then added something unexpected. "One day, in a crowded internet cafe, I saw your video, 'Don't Give Up.' I didn't even understand all your words, but I understood your tears, your passion, your pain, and your hope." Steve looked up, stunned. "You helped a young boy in Burkina Faso believe he could be more than his pain. And that boy became me." The crowd gasped. Some had tears falling freely. Traore smiled gently. "So when I heard your voice again last week, speaking about purpose, I knew it was time I said something back." Steve covered his face. And that's when Traore said something even Steve couldn't believe. President Traore took a deep breath, then looked directly into the camera. "Mr. Harvey," he said, "you once said you wanted to visit Africa, not just as a celebrity, but as a brother, as someone who wants to give back." Steve nodded, whispering, "Yes, I did." "Well," Traore smiled, "I want to invite you, personally, to Burkina Faso, not for cameras, not for attention, but to see what your voice has built in silence." The studio audience gasped. "You've helped lift spirits across oceans. Now let me show you the seeds you've planted in our soil." Steve's hands trembled. He wasn't sure whether to speak or cry. Then came the words that broke him. "There's a young orphanage in Ouagadougou. The children there know your name. They pray with your words. They laugh with your jokes. But most of all, they believe they matter, because you mattered." Steve stood up, eyes full of tears. The audience rose with him, clapping softly, many wiping their own eyes. But Traore wasn't finished. He looked into the lens and added, "In 7 days they'll gather in the village square, waiting to meet the man whose words crossed oceans and healed hearts." The countdown had begun. The very next morning, Steve was already packing. No cameras, no media alert. Just him, a carry-on, and a heart full of questions. The world was buzzing. Every major news outlet ran headlines. President of Burkina Faso moves Steve Harvey to tears. A message that crossed oceans. But Steve wasn't going for the world. He was going for the kids, for that voice that had spoken to his soul. As his plane flew across the Atlantic, he stared out the window. His mind wandered back to his childhood. Growing up poor in Cleveland, the nights they went hungry, the times his dreams seemed too big. And now, he was flying to Africa, called by a president who had once felt the same pain. He whispered to himself, "God, why me?" He didn't know what to expect. Would the kids even recognize him? Would he be strong enough to face them? Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, President Traore stood before a crowd of children in a sunlit courtyard. He smiled and said, "He's coming." The kids screamed in joy, but one little girl in the back had tears in her eyes. She held a small notebook. Inside, she had written a letter to Steve Harvey. Her name was Aisha. She was only 10, small, soft-spoken, and wise beyond her years. In her hand, the notebook shook slightly as she whispered to her caretaker, "Will he read it? Will he care?" The caretaker smiled, kneeling beside her. He's already cared more than most. Aisha's letter wasn't long, but it held a world of pain. "Dear Mr. Steve, my name is Aisha. My papa died 2 years ago. My mama is sick. Sometimes I cry at night. But one day, someone played your video. You said, you were born to do something great. I believed you. Thank you for speaking to us, even if you didn't know we were listening. I hope you smile when you see us. Your little sister, Aisha." As the sun set over Ouagadougou, children practiced songs. Others made drawings with his name. Hope filled the air, but Aisha stayed quiet, sitting near the mango tree, notebook clutched to her chest. In that moment, it wasn't about fame or politics. It was about a man who once slept in a car, meeting a child who sometimes slept without dinner, and the sky seemed to whisper, they were meant to find each other. The plane touched down on a dusty runway just after noon. Steve Harvey stepped out, shielding his eyes from the bright sun. No paparazzi, no grand parade. Just a few guards, 2 translators, and a young aide holding a single sign. "Welcome, Brother Steve." His heart beat faster. Inside a nearby van, he was driven through the streets. Simple homes, small markets, children waving as he passed. When they reached the orphanage gates, he wasn't ready for what he saw. Over 100 children had gathered, holding handmade signs that read, "You matter." "Thank you, Mr. Steve. We love you." Tears filled his eyes. President Traore stepped forward, not in a suit, but in a simple white shirt and traditional cloth. He hugged Steve tightly. "Welcome home," he said. Steve couldn't speak. Then one small voice called from the crowd, "Steve, Steve." It was Aisha. She walked up slowly, her notebook in her trembling hands. She reached out. "This is for you," she whispered. He knelt, opened the letter, read silently. And then he wept. Openly, uncontrollably, and every single person there knew. This wasn't just a visit, it was a divine appointment. Backstage during a short commercial break, Steve sat motionless. The message from President Ibrahim Traore had just finished airing. A producer approached with a paper in hand, an English translation of the full message. "Steve, you'll want to read this part. It's not just about you," she whispered, gently handing it over. Steve's eyes scanned the words, slowly. "When I was a young boy hiding under the wooden table of my grandmother's market stall, I'd hear her laugh as she listened to your voice through a crackling radio. She didn't speak English, but your spirit made her smile in the middle of hard days. That voice helped raise me." Steve covered his mouth. His voice cracked. "Oh my God." The camera was back on, but Steve couldn't fake a smile. He looked into the lens and whispered, "This world, it's smaller than we think, and our words, they travel further than we ever imagine." He wiped a tear as the audience sat in stunned silence. Little did Steve know, this was just the beginning of something far greater. The segment ended. Steve stepped off stage, still holding the letter. He was supposed to move on with the next guest, but something inside him refused to. He walked into his dressing room, phone in hand. He called his producer. "Get me a line to Ouagadougou. I want to speak to President Traore. Today." The producer stuttered, surprised. Yes, sir. I'll work on it now." 2 hours later, a secure Zoom link opened, and there he was. President Ibrahim Traore. Calm, humble. His eyes carried the weight of a nation and the warmth of a brother. Steve looked at him, voice trembling. "Mr. President, I'm just a comedian from Cleveland. I never imagined my voice would reach someone like you." Traore smiled gently. "And I'm just a soldier who loves his people. But even soldiers need hope. You gave me that. Now, I want to give something back." Steve leaned in. "What do you mean?" Traore said softly. "Come to Burkina Faso. Just for one day. There's someone I want you to meet." Steve froze. He had no idea this one sentence would change his life forever. Steve barely slept that night. The president's invitation played on repeat in his mind. But there was one sentence from the letter that haunted him most. "That voice helped raise me." He thought about his own mother, the one who made him believe he could become something. Steve remembered something else too. Years ago, during a rough moment in his career, he had prayed, "God, if I ever get famous, let my words mean something to someone who really needs them." And now this. That night, Steve went back on air for a brief live stream, not with jokes or monologues, but with a truth he couldn't hold in. He held up the translated letter and looked into the camera. "Y'all, I've been blessed with fame, money, success, but this message from a leader I never met, this letter from a boy raised by a grandmother who couldn't understand me but felt me, that's God." He paused. "I gave a promise once, and I'm keeping it." Steve made a decision right there. He was going to Burkina Faso, not for TV, not for ratings, but for something far more important. Steve boarded the private flight to Ouagadougou with a heavy heart and an open mind. It was his first time visiting Burkina Faso. He didn't bring cameras, no press, just his assistant, a translator, and a single journal he hadn't written in for years. As the plane took off, Steve sat by the window, holding the translated letter in his hands again. He had underlined one line in red ink. "I wish my mother could have seen the man you helped me become." It echoed in his mind like a song. He leaned back and whispered to himself, "What did I do to deserve this honor?" Mid-flight, his assistant handed him a small envelope with a wax seal. It was from President Traore. Inside was a handwritten note. "When you land, don't think like a celebrity. Think like a son coming home." Steve pressed the letter to his chest. He didn't know what awaited him on the other side. But deep down, he felt this trip wasn't just about one man's gratitude. It was about healing something buried in both of them, something the cameras had never seen. Steve arrived in Burkina Faso just as the sun began to rise. The airport was quiet, no crowds, no reporters. Just a convoy of 2 black SUVs and 1 tall soldier standing near the door, President Ibrahim Traore himself. Steve stepped down the stairs slowly, unsure of what to say. But Traore walked up and did something unexpected. He embraced him like a brother. No words, just a long, silent hug. Steve's eyes watered. "You came," Traore said simply. "I had to," Steve replied. They drove in silence through the dusty streets. Children waved from the roadside. Some held hand-drawn signs with Steve's name. But their first stop wasn't the palace. It was a small, weathered market, rows of wooden tables covered with fruits, spices, and clothes. Traore led Steve to the very back. "This," he said, pointing to a collapsed stall, "was my grandmother's. Right here is where I listened to you on the radio while helping her count coins." Steve looked down at the dirt, speechless. The president knelt, picked up a small rock, and placed it in Steve's palm. This is where hope began. Steve couldn't hold it anymore. He cried, silently. And so did Traore. Traore guided Steve to a humble village an hour outside the capital. As the car rolled to a stop, a group of women waited under a tree. One of them, elderly and slow-moving, stepped forward. Her hands trembled slightly. "This is Awa," Traore said. "She's the only one still alive who used to sit with my grandmother during market days. She remembers you." Steve looked confused. "But how?" Traore smiled. "They didn't understand your English, but they felt your joy." Awa used to say, "That man has a heart that speaks louder than his tongue." Awa stepped closer. The translator gently repeated her words. "You made the hard days feel lighter. My sister, his grandmother, used to say your voice gave her courage to keep selling when she wanted to give up." Steve knelt, tears falling again. Awa placed her hand on his cheek and whispered something soft in Moore. The translator choked as she translated. She said, "My sister would have fed you if she had met you. She would have called you her son." In that moment, Steve Harvey wasn't a celebrity. He was a son being welcomed home by a mother he never knew he had. And the world watched, speechless. That evening, Steve was invited to a small school where children waited to perform something special. No cameras, no lights, just soft drums and nervous little faces. As Steve entered, the kids began singing a simple tune in Moore, the local language. The translator leaned in and whispered, "It's a song President Traore's grandmother used to hum while cooking at her market stall. Now these children sing it in her honor." Steve froze. The same tune he'd hummed days earlier without knowing why. Tears filled his eyes. "I remember this," Steve whispered. "My grandma in Cleveland. She used to hum something like this when I cried." Traore stood beside him, arms crossed gently. "Our grandmothers, they gave us the same comfort, thousands of miles apart." Steve sat down on the dusty bench, surrounded by children. One girl handed him a wooden carving of two hands holding a heart. He broke, openly, loudly, years of pain, years of questions, all released in a place he never expected. The boy from Ohio and the boy from Ouagadougou, now two men, had found a bond that no script could write. The world didn't see celebrities anymore, only two sons, missing their grandmothers. Before Steve's return flight, President Traore asked to meet one last time, this time at a small plot of land just outside the capital. It was quiet. A tree stood in the center, surrounded by sunflowers. Traore handed Steve a rolled-up certificate tied with a red ribbon. "This land," he said, "now belongs to you. It's a place of peace, a gift from Burkina Faso. So whenever you feel tired or lost, you have a home here." Steve shook his head slowly, overwhelmed. "I didn't come for a gift. I came because your letter made me feel human again." Traore nodded. "And you made my people feel seen. That is worth more than gold." They stood silently under the tree, the wind brushing their faces. Then Traore did something no one expected. He knelt and placed his hand over Steve's chest. "I don't kneel for many," he said, "but I kneel for hearts that change lives." Steve fell to his knees too, and together, two powerful men cried like little boys who missed their grandmothers and found each other in the pain. The next day, Steve's return to the U.S. was met with silence. He asked for no fanfare, no cameras, no show. But something had changed. On his next broadcast before starting the show, Steve walked on stage holding the wooden carving the children gave him, the one with the two hands holding a heart. He placed it gently on his desk. Then he looked into the camera. "In my life, I've received many awards, many gifts, but none like this." His voice cracked. "I met a man, a president, not just of a country, but of the human heart." Ibrahim Traore reminded me of something I forgot, that love, honor, and memory are stronger than anything fame can give you. He paused. He called me a son of Africa. I call him my brother. And then Steve did something rare. He played the children's song live. No translation, just pure innocent voices. Millions watched, millions cried. Comments flooded in from every corner of the world. People didn't see politics. They saw love. They saw legacy. They saw healing. Healed. Let's spread this feeling to the whole world. One story, one tear, one heart at a time.